The crowd gathered at St. Thomas's Church hushed as the pipe organ thundered its processional. Candlelight flickered across polished pews where London's elite sat in their finery, necks craning to glimpse the bride. At the altar stood Mr. Reginald Thornfield, heir to a cotton fortune, his posture rigid as a soldier's, his thin lips pressed into what might generously be called a smile. Charlotte Zelling was not yet visible to the congregation. She stood in the church vestibule, fingers trembling around her bouquet of white roses and lily of the valley. Her wedding gown, exquisitely tailored silk with Belgian lace trim, felt suddenly as constrictive as prison garb. 23 years of dutiful behavior had led her to this moment, the culmination of her parents' ambitions, the securing of her future, the fulfillment of what society deemed a woman's highest purpose. Yet all she could think was, "I cannot breathe. You look radiant, my dear," her mother whispered, adjusting Charlotte's veil with practiced hands. "The Thornfield connection will elevate our family immeasurably. Your father has already been invited to join Reginald's club." Charlotte nodded automatically, the gesture hidden beneath layers of tulle. Through the veil, the world appeared appropriately hazy, as though seen through tears. Perhaps that was fitting for a bride who felt more like a sacrifice than a beloved. "It's time," her father announced, offering his arm. A sudden, paralyzing clarity seized Charlotte. The image of Reginald's calculating, eyes assessing her family's townhouse on his first visit. His comments about how she might benefit from less reading and more attention to domestic arts. The way his hand had gripped her wrist too tightly when she dared disagree with him about a play they'd attended. "Father," she whispered, "I feel faint." "Nonsense, wedding nerves. Everyone experiences them." The organ's volume increased. The doors began to open. Charlotte's vision narrowed to a tunnel, at the end of which stood Reginald Thornfield, a man who had once commented that he preferred wives to have opinions only on matters suitable to their understanding. "I cannot," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "You will," her father hissed, tightening his grip. As the doors swung fully open and the congregation rose, Charlotte made a decision that would alter the course of her life forever. With a sudden jerk, she pulled free of her father's grasp, gathered her skirts, and fled down the church steps into the rain-slicked London streets. Behind her erupted the scandalized gasps of 200 of London's most influential citizens. Ahead lay nothing but uncertainty. Charlotte ran until her sides ached, heedless of the rain soaking through her veil and wedding finery. She had no destination, no plan, only the desperate certainty that marriage to Reginald Thornfield would slowly extinguish whatever spark of true Charlotte remained within her. A passing hackney slowed at the sight of her. A bedraggled bride racing through London streets would attract attention in any weather. The driver, an elderly man with kind eyes, called out, "Miss, are you in need of assistance?" Charlotte hesitated only a moment before climbing in. "Paddington Station, please, as quickly as possible." Her aunt lived in Bath. Perhaps there she could shelter until the worst of the scandal passed, though Charlotte harbored no illusions about what awaited her. A woman who fled her wedding became a pariah, her reputation irreparably damaged. No respectable marriage would follow. No polite drawing room would welcome her. She had effectively removed herself from the society that had shaped her entire existence. Yet as the carriage rattled through London streets, something unfamiliar unfurled in Charlotte's chest, a sensation that, despite everything, might have been freedom. The train station bustled with activity, despite the dreary weather. Charlotte kept her head down, painfully aware of how conspicuous she must appear in her now sodden wedding attire. She had only the few coins in the small purse tied at her wrist, barely enough for a ticket to Bath. As she approached the ticket counter, a commotion near the platform caught her attention. A crowd had gathered around a gentleman who had apparently collapsed. Medical assistance was being called for, and in the confusion, Charlotte saw her opportunity to board the train without purchasing a ticket, an act of dishonesty that would have been unthinkable mere hours before. She slipped through the crowd and onto the train, finding an empty compartment where she could hide herself from curious eyes. Only then did she remove her veil, the symbolic act bringing fresh tears to her eyes. What had she done? Years of believing that a woman's duty was to make an advantageous marriage, that security was worth any sacrifice of personal happiness, all shattered in a moment of panic or courage. She wasn't yet certain which. A woman's only true security lies in making herself pleasing to those with power, her mother had always said. Beauty fades, but fortunate connections endure. The train lurched forward just as the compartment door slid open. Charlotte looked up, startled and fearful of discovery, only to find herself facing the most striking man she had ever encountered. He stood in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in an impeccably tailored greatcoat. Rain had darkened his chestnut hair, and his features might have been carved from marble, strong jawline, straight nose, and eyes of such intense blue that Charlotte felt momentarily unable to look away. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with an air of quiet authority that required no announcement. "Pardon the intrusion," he said, his voice deep and measured. He broke off, clearly taken aback by the sight of a bedraggled bride sitting alone. "Forgive me, madam. I did not realize the compartment was occupied." "Please," Charlotte said, finding her voice. "I don't mind sharing." Something in her tone, perhaps its barely concealed desperation, made him pause. His eyes, keen and observant, took in her disheveled appearance, the absence of luggage, the way her hands trembled slightly as they clutched her veil. "Are you quite all right?" he asked, stepping into the compartment and closing the door behind him. Charlotte attempted a smile. "Perfectly," she lied, "though I imagine I present rather an unusual sight." "Indeed." He remained standing, seeming reluctant to intrude further. "I don't wish to pry, but if you are in some distress." The train rounded a curve, causing Charlotte to sway in her seat. To her mortification, exhaustion and emotion overwhelmed her composure, and tears began falling freely. "I've done something terrible," she confessed, "or wonderful, I cannot decide which." The gentleman hesitated only a moment before sitting down opposite her. He offered a crisp handkerchief, which Charlotte accepted gratefully. "I am Quentin Lockwood, Duke of Westmoreland," he said quietly. Charlotte froze. A duke. Of all the compartments on all the trains leaving London, she had to share one with a man whose social standing placed him at the very pinnacle of the society she had just scandalized. He would surely recognize the situation immediately. A bride fleeing her wedding was sensational gossip, especially in aristocratic circles. "Charlotte Zelling," she replied, seeing no point in deception. "Former bride of Mr. Reginald Thornfield, as of approximately 1 hour ago." She expected judgment or, at minimum, uncomfortable withdrawal. Instead, the Duke's expression showed only thoughtful consideration. "Former bride, an interesting distinction." "I left him at the altar," Charlotte said bluntly, too emotionally exhausted for euphemism. "I have destroyed my reputation, broken my parents' hearts, and likely become the subject of tomorrow's most salacious gossip. But I could not marry him." "May I ask why?" The simple question, asked without apparent censure, opened a floodgate Charlotte had not known existed within her. "He spoke of me as one might discuss a promising filly at auction. He once told me that women who express strong opinions make men uncomfortable, and that discomfort is unnatural. She hesitated, then continued with newfound resolve. "He believes a wife should be an ornament and a convenience, and I realized, standing there in the church, that I would rather face ruin than a lifetime of slowly disappearing." Duke Westmoreland's expression remained unreadable, but something in his eyes, a flash of what might have been recognition, gave Charlotte pause. "Disappearing," he repeated softly, "an apt description of a particular kind of marriage." Before Charlotte could respond, the train screeched to an abrupt halt, throwing her forward. The Duke reached out instinctively, steadying her with strong hands that he quickly withdrew once she was settled. "My apologies," he said, a hint of color rising to his cheeks. An announcement echoed through the train. A tree had fallen across the tracks ahead, and repairs would delay their journey by several hours. Passengers were advised to disembark and seek accommodation in the nearby village if their destinations were urgent. "It seems fate is determined to complicate your escape, Miss Zelling," the Duke observed dryly. Charlotte felt panic rising again. She had no money for accommodations, no change of clothes, and the prospect of spending hours in a public waiting room dressed as a runaway bride was beyond daunting. Duke Westmoreland seemed to read her thoughts. "I have a modest hunting lodge nearby," he said. "Nothing grand but warm and dry." My staff could provide you with appropriate attire while your current garments are attended to. Charlotte regarded him warily. That is very kind, your grace, but I cannot possibly accept. It would be most improper. A faint smile touched his lips, more improper than fleeing your own wedding. Despite everything, Charlotte found herself laughing, the sound surprising them both. You make a fair point, your grace. My housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, is a formidable guardian of propriety. She will ensure everything remains above reproach. And tomorrow, when the tracks are cleared, I can arrange for your continued journey. He paused. Unless you would prefer to brave the village inn in your current state. Charlotte looked down at her bedraggled wedding dress, now stained with coal dust from the train. The decision, like her earlier one at the church steps, required only a moment. I accept your kind offer, your grace, with gratitude. The Duke's hunting lodge proved to be what only a man of his station would consider modest. A handsome stone manor house set among rolling hills, with stables and gardens that spoke of generations of careful tending. Mrs. Winters, as promised, was indeed formidable, a silver-haired woman whose expression upon seeing Charlotte suggested she had witnessed far stranger arrivals in her tenure. Miss Zelling requires dry clothes and a hot meal, Mrs. Winters, the Duke explained with casual authority. She will be our guest until the railway is repaired. Of course, your grace. Mrs. Winters curtsied, her eyes revealing nothing of what she might think about the arrival of a bedraggled bride in her master's company. I'll have the blue room prepared immediately. Charlotte found herself whisked upstairs to a lovely bedchamber where a maid helped her out of her ruined wedding dress. The relief of shedding that garment, symbol of all she had fled, was overwhelming. She bathed in hot water scented with lavender and dressed in borrowed clothes, a simple day dress of blue wool that must have belonged to a female relative of the Duke's. When she descended to the dining room, she found Duke Westmoreland waiting alone, the table set for two. Mrs. Winters sends her regrets that she cannot join us to maintain propriety, he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. However, she will be sitting in the adjacent room with the door open should your virtue require defending. Charlotte couldn't help but smile. The lady is thorough in her duties. Indeed, he held her chair, then took his own seat. I hope you find the clothes adequate. They belong to my sister, who visits occasionally. Over a simple but excellent dinner, Charlotte found herself unexpectedly at ease. The Duke proved to be an attentive listener and thoughtful conversationalist. He spoke of his estates, his parliamentary duties, his interest in agricultural improvements that might benefit tenant farmers. You seem unusually concerned with your tenants' welfare, Charlotte observed. Most landlords I've known consider such matters beneath their direct attention. I inherited not only titles and lands, but responsibilities, he replied. The people who live and work on Westmoreland lands depend upon my stewardship. Their prosperity and mine are intertwined. As the evening progressed, Charlotte realized she had never before experienced conversation as an equal exchange of ideas. Reginald had lectured rather than discussed, had dismissed rather than considered. May I ask a personal question, your grace? He inclined his head. After rescuing a runaway bride, I believe we've moved beyond formalities. Please call me Quentin, at least while we are away from London's prying eyes. Quentin, she said, testing the name. Then you must call me Charlotte. What was your question, Charlotte? You're a duke, surely society expects you to marry. Why have you not done so? A shadow crossed his features. A direct question deserves a direct answer. I was married briefly. My wife, Eleonora, died in childbirth 3 years ago, along with our son. Charlotte's hand flew to her mouth. I am so sorry. How thoughtless of me to pry. Not at all, you couldn't have known. He took a sip of wine before continuing. Ours was not a love match, but a suitable alliance between families. We were finding our way towards something like companionship when she died. Since then, I have found the prospect of another marriage arranged for advantage unappealing. Yet surely the pressure to produce an heir must be considerable. It is. My cousin Vincent currently stands to inherit everything, a prospect that pleases neither of us. He has no interest in estate management and would likely sell off lands that have been in my family for centuries. Quentin's expression darkened momentarily. But I cannot bring myself to approach marriage as a mere transaction again. Perhaps that makes me selfish. No, Charlotte said softly, it makes you human. Their eyes met across the table, and Charlotte felt an unexpected warmth spread through her. Here was a man who saw marriage not as the acquisition of a decorative possession, but as a human connection with potential for growth. The contrast with Reginald could not have been more stark. The moment was broken by Mrs. Winters's discreet cough from the adjacent room, reminding them of her vigilant presence. Quentin smiled slightly. "We are properly chaperoned, Mrs. Winters." "Indeed, Your Grace," came the reply. "Simply ensuring the fire doesn't need tending." Later that night, lying in the comfortable bed in the blue room, Charlotte contemplated the strange turn her life had taken in a single day. By now, all of London would be buzzing with the scandal. Her parents would be facing the social fallout of her actions. Reginald would be either furious, or perhaps worse, relieved to have escaped marriage to a woman of such obviously unstable character. Yet despite the uncertainty of her future, Charlotte felt curiously unburdened. For the first time in her adult life, she had acted according to her own truth rather than others' expectations. Whatever came next would be of her own making. Morning brought sunshine and news that the railway would resume service by afternoon. Charlotte dressed again in her borrowed clothes, steeling herself for the inevitable return to reality. When she joined Quentin for breakfast, she found him reading a newspaper with a troubled expression. "I'm afraid news travels quickly," he said, handing her the paper. There on the society page was the announcement, "Society wedding ends in scandal as bride FLES altar." The article described the shocking behavior of Miss Charlotte Zelling, who abandoned respected businessman Mr. Reginald Thornfield before sacred vows could be exchanged, and speculated wildly about her whereabouts and motives. Charlotte's hands trembled slightly as she returned the paper. "It is no more than I expected." "What will you do now?" Quentin asked gently. "Continue to my aunt in Bath as planned. She's somewhat unconventional and may take me in at least temporarily. After that," she shrugged, attempting nonchalance despite the knot of anxiety in her stomach, "perhaps I can find employment as a governess or companion. My education is better than most." "Charlotte," Quentin said, his voice serious, "there is another option you might consider." Something in his tone made her heart quicken. "Yes. Return to London with me." She stared at him, confused, to face the scandal directly. "I'm not sure I have the courage to face it as my future Duchess." The teacup Charlotte had been holding clattered back to its saucer. "I beg your pardon." Quentin's expression remained earnest. "I am not proposing a love match, Charlotte. We barely know each other, but I am proposing an alliance of mutual respect and shared purpose." "I don't understand." "You need protection from the social consequences of your actions. I need a wife who values substance over appearance, who has the courage of her convictions." He leaned forward slightly. "Marriage to a duke would instantly transform you from scandalous runaway to romantic heroine. And I would gain a partner I can respect, rather than an ornament to display." Charlotte felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath her. "This is madness. We met only yesterday. And yet I know more about your character from that meeting than I learned about my first wife in months of courtship." His eyes held her steadily. "You value independence of thought. You have courage. You refuse to sell yourself into a life of quiet misery despite every social pressure to conform. Those same qualities make me completely unsuitable as a duchess," Charlotte protested. "Society expects perfect compliance, perfect decorum." "Society will accept whatever I tell them to accept," Quentin said, with the casual confidence of a man who had never had his right to self-determination questioned. Then, seeming to realize how that sounded, he added more gently, "Forgive me. I don't mean to sound arrogant, but my position does afford certain latitude." Charlotte stood, needing distance to think clearly. This proposal was even more shocking than her flight from the church had been. "You cannot possibly be serious." "I am entirely serious." Quentin remained seated, apparently understanding her need for space. I have spent 3 years avoiding remarriage because I could not bear the thought of another union based solely on advantage and breeding. Yet in you, I see the possibility of something different, a partnership of equals, despite what society might say about a woman's place. And if I refuse, then I will ensure you reach your aunt safely, with funds sufficient to establish yourself wherever you choose. His voice softened. This is an offer, Charlotte, not a trap. You have already proven yourself brave enough to reject a future you could not accept. I would never ask you to surrender that courage. Charlotte turned to the window, gazing out at the sunlit gardens, while her thoughts raced. Marriage to a duke would indeed transform scandal into romance. The public adored tales of noblemen choosing brides for love rather than connection. Her parents would be overjoyed rather than disgraced. She would never want for material comfort again. But more compelling than any of these considerations was the man himself. In their brief acquaintance, Quentin had shown her more genuine respect than Reginald had in months of courtship. He had listened to her, valued her thoughts, offered assistance without demanding submission in return. Yet there remained an insurmountable fact: we do not love each other. No, Quentin agreed, but I believe we could learn to. There are worse foundations for marriage than mutual respect and shared principles. Charlotte turned back to face him. If I were to consider your proposal, and I am not saying I will, I would require certain assurances. Name them. I would need freedom to pursue my own interests, to read what I choose, to form my own opinions, to speak my mind without fear of disappointing you. Granted, without reservation. I would need to know that you truly see me as a partner, not merely a convenient solution to your need for an heir. At this, Quentin rose and approached her, stopping at a respectful distance. Charlotte, I have spent 3 years surrounded by women eager to become my duchess, women carefully trained to reflect my every opinion and anticipate my every desire. What I value in you is precisely your unwillingness to surrender your selfhood for security. His sincerity was palpable, his blue eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. In that moment, Charlotte felt something shift within her, a recognition that perhaps her parents had been wrong. Perhaps true security lay not in making oneself pleasing to those with power, but in being valued for one's authentic self. I don't know what to say, she admitted. Say you'll consider it. He took her hand gently. Return to London with me. Let me present you to society as my choice, not as a woman in disgrace. Give us time to discover if what I believe could grow between us is possible. Charlotte looked down at their joined hands. Yesterday morning, she had stood in a church vestibule, preparing to surrender her future to a man who saw her as little more than an attractive possession. Now she stood before a duke who offered her choice, respect, and the possibility of something she had never dared hope for. A marriage of equals. Yes, she said finally. I will return to London with you and I will consider your proposal. The relief and pleasure that transformed Quentin's features sent an unexpected warmth through Charlotte. Whatever came next, she had made this choice freely, with open eyes. The journey back to London was both surreal and oddly comfortable. In the private railway compartment Quentin secured, they continued their conversations from the previous evening, discovering shared interests in literature and social reform. Charlotte found herself laughing more freely than she could remember doing in years. My mother would be scandalized by this entire situation, she admitted. She raised me to believe that a lady should never express strong opinions, lest she appear unfeminine. And what do you believe? Quentin asked. That minds are not gendered, that intelligence and curiosity are human traits, not male ones. She smiled wryly. Dangerous notions, I'm told. Not to me. His gaze was warm. I find your mind one of your most attractive qualities. Such simple words, yet they affected Charlotte more profoundly than the most elaborate compliments Reginald had ever paid her appearance. She looked away, suddenly shy. As the train approached London, however, Charlotte's anxiety returned. What will people say? How will you explain my presence? The truth, with appropriate modifications, Quentin replied. We met by chance, felt an immediate connection, and I persuaded you to break your engagement to Thornfield. That makes me sound rather fickle. It makes you sound like a woman who recognized a deeper attachment than the one society had arranged for her. He took her hand. Leave the gossips to me, Charlotte. London has never dictated to me. I see no reason it should start now. True to his word, Quentin handled their arrival in London with masterful confidence. His carriage met them at the station, bearing his ducal crest for all to see. He escorted Charlotte first to her parents' home, where he personally explained his intentions to her astonished family. Charlotte would never forget the transformation of her mother's expression from frozen horror at her daughter's return to dawning wonder as Quentin formally requested permission to court her. But the scandal, her father stammered. What scandal? Quentin asked smoothly. Miss Zelling merely had the wisdom to recognize that her heart belonged elsewhere before making vows she could not honor. Society will remember only that she became a duchess, not the circumstances that preceded it. Later, after arrangements were made for Charlotte to stay with her married cousin in Mayfair during the courtship, a concession to propriety that Quentin insisted upon, he escorted her to the carriage. You were magnificent, Charlotte told him. I've never seen my father rendered speechless before. Quentin smiled. The advantage of a title is that people rarely argue with you, even when they probably should. His expression grew more serious. I've arranged for us to attend Lady Harrington's ball tomorrow evening. It will be your first public appearance since the church. Are you prepared for that? Charlotte took a deep breath. With you beside me, yes. The moment lingered between them, charged with something neither was quite ready to name. Until tomorrow, then, Quentin said softly, lifting her hand to his lips in a gesture that sent a shiver of anticipation through Charlotte. Until tomorrow, she echoed. Lady Harrington's ball was the social event of the season, a glittering affair attended by the highest echelons of London society. Charlotte, dressed in a new gown of deep emerald silk, a gift from Quentin that she had initially protested but ultimately accepted, felt every eye upon her as they entered the ballroom. Conversations paused, heads turned, fans fluttered as whispers spread like wildfire. Courage, Quentin murmured, his hand warm at the small of her back. Remember who you are. Who was she? No longer the dutiful daughter willing to sacrifice herself for family advancement. Not yet the Duchess Quentin proposed she might become. Someone in between, a woman discovering her own strength, her own voice. Lady Harrington approached, her aristocratic features composed in a mask of polite welcome that didn't quite reach her eyes. Your Grace, she said, curtsying to Quentin before turning a considerably cooler gaze on Charlotte. Miss Zelling. How unexpected to see you here. Miss Zelling is my guest, Lady Harrington, Quentin said, his tone pleasant but carrying an undertone of steel. I trust she will receive every courtesy. The message was clear. Charlotte stood under his protection. Lady Harrington, whatever her personal feelings about a woman who had fled her own wedding, was not foolish enough to offend the Duke of Westmoreland. Of course, Your Grace, Miss Zelling is most welcome. Lady Harrington's smile remained fixed as she moved away to greet other guests. Throughout the evening, Charlotte weathered curious stares and whispered comments with a composure that surprised even herself. Quentin remained steadfastly by her side, dancing only with her, engaging her in conversation that deliberately included those around them, making it clear to all that she held his highest regard. During a waltz, as they moved together across the polished floor, Quentin drew her slightly closer than was strictly proper. You are remarkable, he said quietly. Most women would have crumbled under half the scrutiny you faced tonight. Perhaps I simply have more at stake, Charlotte replied. My entire future depends on my performance here. Something flickered in Quentin's eyes, concern, perhaps, or disappointment. Is that how you see this, a performance to secure your position? Charlotte realized her mistake immediately. No, she said earnestly, that came out wrong, I meant. She struggled to articulate feelings still forming within her. What I value about you, about us, is that there is no performance. You've seen me at my worst, bedraggled, desperate, fleeing my own wedding, and still found something worthwhile. The music swelled around them as Quentin's expression softened. I see you, Charlotte Zelling. Not the daughter your parents raised to make an advantageous match, not the potential Duchess society is now reassessing. You. The simple declaration, spoken in the midst of London's most elegant ballroom, affected Charlotte more deeply than grand romantic gestures ever could have. For a breathless moment, she thought he might kiss her, propriety be damned. Instead, he guided her through the final turns of the waltz with perfect decorum, though his eyes promised conversations yet to come. As they prepared to leave the ball, a commotion at the entrance drew their attention. Reginald Thornfield, flushed with what appeared to be both anger and wine, stood arguing with a footman. "I demand to see her," he was saying, his voice carrying clearly across the now hushed ballroom. "She has made me a laughingstock, and I will have satisfaction." Charlotte froze, her earlier confidence evaporating at the sight of the man she had abandoned. Quentin's hand tightened protectively around hers. "Stay here," he murmured. "I will handle this." "No," Charlotte said, surprising herself with her steadiness. "We will handle it together." They approached Reginald, whose belligerence faltered visibly at the sight of the Duke of Westmoreland, escorting the woman who had jilted him. "Mr. Thornfield," Quentin said coolly, "you appear to be creating a disturbance at a private gathering to which, I presume, you were not invited." Reginald drew himself up. "I have every right to confront the woman who humiliated me before all of society. Charlotte, how could you?" "Miss Zelling to you," Quentin interrupted, his tone glacial. "And you have no rights regarding her whatsoever. She was to be my wife." "Yet she chose not to be," Charlotte said, finding her voice. "A choice I made before any vows were exchanged, before any legal commitment existed between us." Reginald's face darkened with fury. "So you abandoned me for a duke? I always knew you had ambitions above your station, Charlotte, but to throw yourself at Westmoreland so shamelessly—" "That is quite enough," Quentin cut in, his voice dangerously quiet. "You will apologize to Miss Zelling immediately, or you will find yourself facing me at dawn." The threat of a duel, illegal but still occasionally practiced among the aristocracy, silenced Reginald instantly. Challenging a duke would be social suicide, regardless of the outcome. "I apologize for my intemperate words," he muttered, not meeting Charlotte's eyes. "Mr. Thornfield," Charlotte said, surprising herself with her composure, "I regret the manner of our parting, if not the parting itself. I wish you well in finding a wife better suited to your expectations." Without waiting for his response, she turned away, Quentin's hand still firmly clasping hers as they moved through the now-riveted crowd toward the exit. Once in the privacy of his carriage, Charlotte let out a shaky breath. That was intense. "You were magnificent," Quentin said, genuine admiration in his voice. "Most women would have wilted under such a confrontation." "I'm discovering I'm not most women." Charlotte looked out at the lamplit streets of London passing by. "All my life I was taught that a woman's greatest asset is her ability to please others, particularly men, that our own desires and opinions are secondary if they matter at all. And now—" She turned back to him, finding his gaze intent upon her face. "Now I wonder if perhaps my mother was wrong. Perhaps a woman's greatest asset is her courage to be herself, regardless of who it pleases." Quentin reached across the carriage to take her hand. "If you truly believe that, Charlotte Zelling, then you will make a far better duchess than this duke deserves." In the weeks that followed, London society gradually shifted from scandalized whispers about the runaway bride to romantic sighs over the duke's whirlwind courtship. Charlotte, guided by Quentin's unwavering support, emerged from the shadow of scandal into the light of general approval, though she found, somewhat to her surprise, that the approval of others mattered far less to her than it once had. She and Quentin established a routine of daily walks, visits to art exhibitions, and quiet evenings in his library, where conversations ranged from literature to politics to personal philosophies. With each passing day, Charlotte felt herself growing not only more comfortable in his presence, but increasingly unable to imagine a future without him in it. Yet doubts lingered. Had she simply exchanged one advantageous match for another, albeit a far grander one? Was she truly in love with Quentin, or merely grateful for his rescue? And did he love her, or simply appreciate the qualities that made her different from the typical aristocratic bride? These questions haunted her still when, 6 weeks after her flight from the church, Quentin invited her to tour the gardens of his London residence. As they walked among blooming roses, he seemed uncharacteristically nervous. "I've been thinking," he said finally, "about our initial arrangement." Charlotte's heart quickened. "Yes, sir. When I first proposed that you return to London with me, I suggested a marriage of mutual respect and shared purpose." He stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "I still believe in those principles, Charlotte, but I find they are no longer sufficient." A cold fear gripped her. Had he changed his mind, found her wanting in some crucial way? "I understand," she said stiffly, pride keeping her chin high despite the pain blooming in her chest. "You need not honor an offer made in haste." Quentin looked startled. "That's not," he shook his head, then suddenly dropped to one knee on the garden path, taking both her hands in his. "Charlotte Zelling, I am making a complete mess of this. What I am trying to say is that I love you. Not for the Duchess you might become, or for the scandal you might help me overcome, but for yourself, your courage, your intelligence, your unwillingness to surrender your soul for security." Charlotte stared down at him, speechless. "I intended to court you properly," Quentin continued, "to give you time to discover if you could feel for me what I have come to feel for you. But I find I can no longer pretend this is a merely practical arrangement. I want you as my wife because I love you, and for no other reason." Tears welled in Charlotte's eyes as the truth of her own heart became suddenly, blindingly clear. "I fled my wedding because I couldn't bear the thought of a loveless marriage," she said softly. "I never expected to find love instead, especially not with a duke who saw me at my worst and somehow found something to value." "Is that a yes?" Quentin asked, hope transforming his features. "It's a yes," Charlotte confirmed, her smile radiant through her tears. "I love you, Quentin Lockwood, and I would be honored to become your Duchess." He rose, drawing her into his arms for their first kiss, a gentle meeting of lips that quickly deepened into something that sent warmth cascading through Charlotte's entire body. When they finally parted, both breathless, Quentin rested his forehead against hers. "My remarkable Charlotte," he murmured. "How fortunate I am that you chose to flee your wedding on the very day I was traveling to London." "Perhaps it wasn't fortune at all," she replied. "Perhaps it was always meant to be." 3 months later, Charlotte Zelling became the Duchess of Westmoreland in a ceremony attended by the highest members of society, all eager to witness the culmination of what was now considered the season's most romantic courtship. Even her parents, initially mortified by her behavior, now proudly claimed they had always seen extraordinary qualities in their daughter. As Charlotte spoke her vows, this time with absolute certainty and joy, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From a young woman willing to sacrifice herself on the altar of societal expectations, to one who had found the courage to demand more from life than mere security. From believing that a woman's greatest value lay in her ability to please others, to understanding that true value came from being authentically oneself. And as Quentin gazed down at her with eyes full of love and admiration, Charlotte knew she had found not only a husband, but a partner who would walk beside her rather than ahead of her, who would value her mind as much as her beauty, who would encourage rather than constrain her growth. "I love you," he whispered as they turned to face the congregation as husband and wife. "And I love you," Charlotte replied, stepping forward into her future with the man who had indeed changed her heart forever with just one look, not because of his title or his wealth, but because he had seen her, truly seen her, when she had been invisible even to herself.